Welcome back to Sometimes Love Isn't Enough, the Parenting Through Challenges podcast. I am your host, Angie Grant, and today I want to into ADHD and other diagnoses. And not because, right, I'm not a diagnostician, and I'm not here to dispute your child's diagnosis, add to it, remove it. That isn't my role here. What I'm really wanting to do today is to open your eyes or reopen your eyes to what can potentially be behind the behavior that we see. I remember the first time that I got a call that I was a licensed foster parent, and the first call that I got that we have a set of siblings for you. And I asked, they were older. The boys were older than what I had requested in my family. I had requested kids younger than my daughter at the time. And these boys were a little bit older, not much, but a little bit. And so I asked, what is their diagnostic history? What can I expect with these boys? And the social worker said, um, they have a diagnosis of ADHD. And I said, "Oh, that's it?" And she said, "Yeah, as far as we know, that's all that's in their file." So we said yes, as many parents do, right? Whether you're a foster parent, an adoptive parent, or a biological parent, we we take these diagnoses as if they're the truth, right? A medical doctor gave them this diagnosis. But I know that my story is so similar to so many other foster parents and biological parents as well, but particularly foster parents, this idea that my foster sons came to us with a diagnosis of ADHD. It's so common. It's so common for kids who come from a challenging home life, kids who have a tricky past, to get a label of ADHD. I mean, think about how many parents do you know, or maybe you're one of them, where your child has this diagnosis. And again, I'm not here to dismiss it, but I want to gently challenge your thoughts about it and expand your view of what this really means for our kids. Because ADHD is real. It is a real diagnosis. It's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And diagnoses can be very helpful. And I know as parents, we're doing our very best. But I know for myself, I was desperate to try to find a label to understand the behaviors that I was seeing in my home. Especially, I mean, this was true with the foster kids, but also with my own son, that I was so desperately seeking that next label that would help me make sense of what I was seeing. Because when our kids, whether our kids come to our home or they're part of our kids aren't labels. It isn't part of their identity. Our kids have experiences and they have nervous system adaptations, and our kids have unmet needs. And so that's what I want to dig into in this episode. And again, this isn't an anti-diagnosis episode by any means, because I know that there is value in understanding. But I think as parents, at least in my experience, to me, it felt like that medical diagnosis gave me clarity to better understand. And then it didn't. It gave me clarity to have a label to give to what I was experiencing in my home, but then it didn't quite explain everything. And I couldn't understand why it was so hard to connect. Because for my son, for the foster kids in our home, and for many of our kids who even, right, I want to talk today about trauma and what it does to our brain. But these concepts can apply to our kids who have lived in a relatively normal, whatever that is, home where they haven't experienced some type of extreme trauma. But the things that our kids experience today is so different than what we experienced as parents when it comes to bullying, when it comes to less connection, less of their human needs being met. And not because we're not trying as parents, but because there's so many things now that pull us as parents into so many different directions that at the base of it all, humans have some really core important needs. As humans, we need to feel loved. And there's research to show that when babies don't feel loved at a very early age, that it can have catastrophic effects on their well-being and sometimes on their vitality or their life. That this is a documented, um, uh, a known thing about humans that we need to be loved. As humans, we need to feel like we belong. We need to feel like we have power over our own life. When, as humans, and we need to feel like we can be our authentic selves. We need to connect with others. And so when, as parents, we have so many things pulling us in so many different directions, and we ourselves are struggling to be regulated, connecting with our kids is harder. Giving our kids what they need to fulfill their human needs becomes harder and harder for parents. It's not that it's not possible, and it's not that you're not trying. It's not that I am not trying. There are just so many real and perceived barriers that can get in our way of connecting with our kids. And so in this episode, I do want to dig a little bit into trauma and its influence on the brain. I know we've talked about this before, but I think there's so many concepts that not only do I, but I know people around me need to hear time and time again. And each time we hear it, we think about it a little bit differently. And each time I share it with you, I speak about it a little bit differently. And I've been doing this work and living this life and being in this realm of trying to wrap my head around the impacts of trauma. Personally, in my own life, before I even knew how to wrap my head around it, but then as a parent and as a professional for, I don't know, 16 years now or more, and I still find my mind still reverts back to seeing a behavior as a behavior sometimes. And so I will continue to repeat these concepts because I think we have so much unlearning to do about understanding what's happening with our kids. We have so many patterns to break in from generations of parenting. And again, this isn't about shaming. It's about really acknowledging where we're at today and that our kids need different from us. So let's talk a little bit about trauma and the brain. Our brain, we have several parts to our brain that the kind of big top part when people think about the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's the part where we do our thinking and problem solving and reasoning and remembering. It is where we make active, conscious decisions based on information that we have presented to us, which is different than in a recent episode, I was talking quite a bit about making decisions based on our energy, through our type, through human design. But we also do have this ability to make decisions, to think things through, to problem solve with our brain. We all know that. What I was talking about a couple of episodes ago was that to make decisions that are aligned for our energy, oftentimes our brain isn't the way to do that. But our brain is the way to take, a ton of information and to work through it and make sense of it to make decisions based on the information presented to us. That might not be what's aligned for us, but nonetheless, it is a way of making decisions. And so that prefrontal cortex, it has the ability to plan things out and make decisive action, right? But that isn't what is making the decisions for us when our survival brain has been activated. And what that means then is when our kids or ourselves have experienced some types of trauma or are dealing with big stressors that are causing the survival part of our brain to not only be more activated in that moment or sometimes for longer periods of time, but when our survival brain is activated, that prefrontal cortex is not. That it is designed to help keep us safe. The problem is that our survival brain is it's not smart enough to know the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. And the survival part of our brain doesn't know the difference. It doesn't understand time concepts. And so something that happened 15 years ago, and there's been no evidence that it will continue to happen or that it's going to happen again, the survival part of our brain doesn't understand time and will react as if we're still in that moment when it is triggered. And using the prefrontal cortex to think ourselves out of that is challenging. It requires intentional, conscious work to get our prefrontal cortex back online. And so when we take this concept and we apply it to our kids who have had a traumatic past or who are maybe dealing with bullying at school or who are stressed and overwhelmed because mom and dad are stressed and overwhelmed about adult things that they don't even understand, or a whole slew of things, if that survival part of the brain is activated, the nervous system is activated, and our kids' ability to pay attention drops significantly because they're in this space of being hypervigilant, of scanning their environment for perceived danger, and our kids become impulsive. They become impulsive because they are not in a place to consciously think through what they're doing. And when our kids can't consciously think through their decisions, their actions, they're acting more impulsively, they they can very much look like a kid who has ADHD because their ability to focus has significantly dropped and their impulsivity has significantly increased because they lack that control that their prefrontal cortex provides for them. And so we have these kids, so many kids who are dealing with regular and frequent bullying, or kids who have had a traumatic past, or kids who, maybe mom and dad separated at a time that developmentally that was especially hard for them. Or we have kids who mom and dad have separated and energetically that is especially hard for them. Did you know that some kids have a much, much harder time with parental separation because of their energetic needs? Some kids need that family unit. And some kids can handle the separation better than others. So, my point being that what can look like ADHD, what can look like an inability to sit still, being distractible, being impulsive, may indeed be a child who has an activated nervous system. It may be that distracted child may be a child who's scanning their environment for safety because although they might be perfectly safe, their nervous system doesn't know the difference. In our kids who look more impulsive, for example, it could actually be a lack of regulation, not a lack of discipline, not a lack of being a good kid or being a bad kid, right? I really want to challenge you when we think about the way that we look at our kids and these diagnoses, which again, I'm not disputing ADHD, but sometimes I think when we label our kids as having ADHD, it may indeed be something else. Because a brain that's focused on survival is not a brain that's available for math or reading or writing or even following simple directions sometimes. I know for me, that's what would drive me nuts was that my son is so bright, so incredibly bright, but I would often have situations where I would give him a simple instruction to go to the kitchen and, get a bowl or run to your room and grab your Legos. And he couldn't follow through with those instructions. But then in other situations, he could follow long, complex, multi-step instructions. And I couldn't wrap my head around, they say he has ADHD, but it doesn't match. It doesn't make sense to me. Sometimes he could seem so focused and so attentive, and then other times be so impulsive and so distracted. So, having that ability to see our kids through a different lens, through the lens of trauma, is one angle that we can look at what can be so easily labeled as ADHD behaviors. But I don't think it ends there. I also think that for some of our kids, or for all of our kids, right? I had talked recently, I've had a couple of episodes about this, but I talked recently about this idea of mistaken motivations, and that there are four mistaken motivations that really are evidence for us, right? The mistaken motivation looks like a behavior problem. That's what cues us in that there's an unmet energetic need. And all of us have very different needs based on our type, based on our profile, based on several other elements in our design, based on our basic human needs that we all have. But some of us are wired to need more connection. Some of us are wired to need more support. Some of us are wired to need to feel more powerful. But these also, when our kids have these unmet needs, can also look like ADHD or other diagnoses. So, for example, the mistaken motivation of attention, or I like to call it the mistaken motivation of connection, could could look like ADHD in the kiddo who seems to be attention seeking or being impulsive, right? It could really be a kiddo who's saying, like, I need somebody to connect with me right now, and I don't have a great way to ask for that. Or I've tried to ask and I was misunderstood. Or the child who is seems to need to have everything, you know, in a particular order or in a certain manner. What if that really isn't a symptom of a diagnosis, but is instead the mistaken motivation of power, that need to feel in control because other things feel out of control in their life, or because they have a strong innate need to feel powerful? And what to us, as the adults, as the clinicians, as the parents, to us, it might look like a child who needs to control everything or be so particular about rules or struggle with transitions. What if instead it's the mistaken motivation of power or the mistaken motivation of inadequacy? When we see in our kids who won't try, it seems like they can't focus. But what if instead it really is the mistaken motivation of inadequacy and they're feeling like they're not good enough, that they can't do it, so they just won't even try? Or the last mistaken motivation is the one of revenge, where it looks to us as the parents or caregivers, as a kiddo who is maybe being aggressive or being destructive. When what if that behavior that we see that we're labeling as ADHD or something else or oppositional defiant disorder, what if what looks to us like a diagnosis is really an unmet need? Because I really encourage you to think about that, to wrap your head around that. What if what we're calling a behavior problem and we're treating with a medication or we're treating with therapy, for example, is something that we as the parents could diagnose with our kids, not through a medical lens, but through this lens of what does our kiddo need from me right now? Because our kids' behavior will make so much more sense when you understand what that need is underneath it. And the last lens, right? So when I think about behaviors, I think about trauma, I think about those unmet needs or mistaken motivations. And of course, the third lens that I think about behaviors is that lens of human design. That our kids are wired differently. Our kids have different needs. Some of us as humans are wired to be logical, methodical thinkers. There's actually a energy tract through the human design blueprint that is it's all about logic. And on the flip side, there's another energy track that is the track of creativity. And logic and creativity are both necessary parts of, all of our interactions and in our workplace and in our school. And they're different, right? Some kids are energetically designed to to be able to logically work through things, and some of our kids are not. Some kids need movement and variety. Some kids need to respond to things showing up to them. Some of our kids have this inner drive that is guiding them to the next right thing for them, which probably won't be what you think is the next right thing for them because you're not in them. You're not your kids. And some of our kids are so deeply sensitive to the environment, to smells, to what they hear, to the tone that people use in their vocabulary. Some of our kids, some kids are so in tune with the fears of others or the emotions of others. And all of these different, beautiful, unique elements of our kids can have the potential to present like a kiddo who is struggling to pay attention, who is being more impulsive, who can't, show their work on their math homework. Some of our kids are really designed to follow what lights them up and not sit still and focus on things that don't. And I think very few of our kids are designed to fit in the box, and I put air quotes around that, but the box around what we think is right, how our kids are supposed to behave. We have this framework in our mind, this belief. We all have it. And some of our boxes are bigger than others, but we all have this belief about how good kids behave. It is how we were conditioned to think about kids, that there are good kids who are well behaved and they act a certain way, and there are bad kids, or maybe you don't use that word, but that idea of there are kids who don't behave as well, who don't fit in that box. And I would argue that most kids, the vast majority of kids, are not designed to fit in whatever the box is that you have created, that I have created, that the schools have created for our kids. So my hope for this episode is really to bring light to this idea that labels can be dangerous because when we only see ADHD or we only see oppositional defiance disorder or we only see reactive attachment disorder or we only see anxiety, then we manage the behaviors. But when we see the child and what is really underneath the surface, when we really see those unmet needs, when we really see those energetic needs, when we really take a step back and look at our child, then we see how to meet their needs. And we ask different questions. So, what does this mean for you, right? Whether you're a parent or a caregiver, my hope is that this opens the door for you to shift from correcting behavior to being more curious about what's underneath it. Because, right, we're in this loop with our kids. Everything that I just said about your kids also applies to you. You also are in a place where perhaps you're more reactive to what your kids are doing, that you have had experiences with your kids or other kids, or you have this strongly held belief about how kids are supposed to behave. And when our kids keep behaving outside of our expectations, it can be distressing for us. And when it keeps happening over and over again, and we perceive that we've lost more control over what's happening with our kids and they're acting less and less, like our belief system, that perceived loss of control can cause us to also activate our stress response, the stress response part of our brain, because our brain seeks safety. And when we perceive that we've lost control, we seek safety. And so this is a feedback loop between us and our kids, that they're triggering us and us trying to address the behaviors triggers them. And then it carries on and on and on. It is up to us to break that cycle, not our kids. So when we can shift from correction, we become more curious. When we support our kids' regulation first, well, actually support our own regulation first and then our kids, we get different responses from them. And we allow different ways of learning for our kids and really being curious about, you know, as parents, we tend to know these things about our kids. We tend to know that, we have one kid who's really creative and one kid who's, really loves the more like logical type subjects in school. We know that about our kids, and yet we struggle with what do we do about that? We struggle to take that step to then really tap in to how they learn in a powerful way that helps them feel like it's safe to be their authentic selves. And I also find it just so important to say this out loud because I've been there too. And this is not parent shaming at all, because I say this with a heart that I have been there too, but to really be mindful about the words that we use and the labels that we give our kids, to be mindful about the shame that it can create in them. Because our words matter so much. And when we are seeing our kids as a list of behaviors or diagnoses and not really seeing them and seeing those unmet needs, it has an impact on them, and it has an impact on us, and it has an impact on our relationship with them. And I don't want that for you, and I don't want that for them. So as I wrap this up, your child is not a diagnosis. They're a human with a human story and a nervous system and such a unique design. So when you're ready to really understand your kiddo, I'd love to connect with you. I have details in the show notes about how to book a connection clarity call. I can't wait to help you to expand the lens that you see your kiddo through, because this is the work that lights me up. This is the work that I can help do with you as well. So until next time, be well.